over the years, and it's so nice to see so many of you again. I'm so glad you're here. I will go ahead. I know our time is short, so I just want to jump in quickly and go through everything. So what I'm going to be talking about with you is I'm going to try not to drop everything. I'm going to walk you through this, if that works for everyone. Basically, it's from logic to senior thesis. Okay, and I'm basically going to use the CAP curriculum as our backdrop for how we get from point A to point B. So the first thing that I want to say is we actually have to back up just one tiny step further and just talk about the fact that we need some sort of a framework for language. And so grammar and writing is going to be an essential part of this whole process from the years of elementary level, grammar school level, and into middle school level. So that's going to be really important. And the way I try to describe it for most of the folks I talk with is, imagine that the river that we're aiming for is the river rhetoric. That's where we're kind of aiming. And that at a certain point, logic has to get paired with grammar and the basics of writing in order to come and flow into this upper school rhetoric program that we're really aiming students to, and to that senior thesis. So, and how we come to from the grammar side, obviously, is with hopefully a good foundational study of Latin, as well as a grammar courses in English, as well as and at CAP we have the Writing and Rhetoric series, which takes us through the Progymnasmata. And so I'm actually going to start there just for a tiny moment, because a lot of people don't fully appreciate maybe or understand why the progym is so important. So the progym is a whole other book series, which I'm not going to talk about today, but it's this idea that Quintilian sort of, provides to us throughout history, where we take different kinds of writing and we start to give students these different kinds of tools, whether it's being able to write with fable or write in narrative, or to learn to praise something or learn to blame something, or, so encomium and vituperation, and then, being able to craft comparison essays and contrast essays, or writing thesis papers. All of these different parts are all highlighted in various, in different stages and times during a child's young writing career. And the idea is that you're basically giving them tools to put into their toolbox, so that when they get to the point where they're in their upper school rhetoric classes and they need to, sometimes when people who don't write a whole lot or don't write sort of in a classical rhetoric style, we hear people talk about, well, you need a hook at the beginning, right? And I loathe that phrasing, as if like so kids go looking for a quote, right? And then they throw a quote up there. They come up with some sort of pithy colloquial saying or something, and they get their hook. But that catch-all idea of a hook is probably something where they need to introduce, maybe with an analogy of some sort, or some sort of allegory, or they need to start with maybe a maxim or a proverb of some sort that they might start with as they're writing, and then they need to fold those in as points of explanation and example, all the way through the writing that they do for those upper level rhetoric writing assignments that they're going to do in their sophomore, junior, and senior years of high school. But all along the way, if they've learned how to write short fables, if they've learned how to write proverbs or to quote proverbs, or they've collected all of these different rhetorical tools that then they can go and include little snippets of these when they're writing for their upper school rhetoric classes, which comes in handy a little while later. So I think it's very important that students have a good foundation in grammar and in different kinds of writing, all the way up to the point where they begin their study of logic. And the study of logic is, as many of you know, it's both an art and a science, right? It's the art and the science of reason. But what logic requires is that students have a well-stocked mind. So if we start there, we need to have given them something that they can think about. And that's usually one of the concerns that I see with students who maybe come into an art of argument class or into a discovery of deduction class, is that if they if they haven't been exposed to a wide array of content knowledge, then it becomes exceedingly difficult for them to make sense of the situation that we're asking them to then do logic on, to do reasoning with. And so it's very important that in those writing assignments in those early years that we are exposing them to age-appropriate kinds of concepts and ideas, whether it's compassion or empathy, biography, historical fiction, newspaper articles, what's just going on in the world right now. And then asking them to engage with writing of all kinds, and it could be literary references, but whatever, and it's never one thing. It's right. The well-stocked mind is going to be this idea that it's across many disciplines, right? So engaging with them in those younger years with lots of great enriched stories about mathematicians and scientists and the stories of their trials gone well and trials gone poorly. You know, stories of heroism and bravery, of wars and well-fought wars and poorly fought wars, and conquering heroes and defeated, you know, defeated cultures, and you know, and as they get older, the good in that and the injustice in some of those situations as well, and beginning to build into them this well-stocked mind that they can then, when they get into their middle school years and it's time to start logic, that they have some frame of reference for the content that we're asking them to engage with. I've seen very often when students get to a book like The Art of Argument, which is the first book that we would we would ask students to consider doing maybe in the 7th or 8th grade, that there are about 28 fallacies in there, maybe 32 if you're thinking about sort of the subcategories of fallacies that are in the Art of Argument. And I've seen teachers and students kind of go through this book in two ways. One of them I recommend and one of them I don't. The way that I would not recommend going through the book is seeing it basically as a new vocabulary lesson, that there are 28 words to learn how to spell and memorize, and to know their etymology and sort of where they come from or whatever. And we are just going to focus on just those few examples that are in there. And it's really just a way of thinking through a new set of vocabulary that kind of, you know, gives you a little bit of a window in the world kind of thing. That framing up of the logic class as just you know, some quick and dirty tips about how to, you know, engage in the world around them with these new 28 words that they have is probably not as robust as we really want that course to be. What we're really hoping with any of these books is that logic comes out of the confines of the textbook covers, and that they begin to see how it connects to, informs, and actually is part of our way of thinking for the world all around us. And to do that, then we need to encourage them to continue having rich and robust conversations with their peers, but also with folks with whom they're going to really have to kind of stretch to get to. That they're going to have to engage in a level of conversation that might just be a bit out of their grasp if they were going to think through it on their own, but with a wise and good teacher who might be able to help them come up to that next level of discourse a little bit, and reveal to them you know, how this fits into a larger narrative or into the larger conversation, where some of the pitfalls have been, and that kind of thing. But just memorizing the informal fallacies as a form of vocabulary is really not what we're shooting for there. I have seen some schools wanting to sort of check the box of getting logic done, and they want to cover the informal fallacies. So they put it into one semester, or they do it alongside maybe their English curriculum, right? And they kind of teach them how to spot some of these things as they're doing some reading or that kind of thing. And what we find is that the students, and for some of our Novari folks that are here, you know this, it's that you know, what is it, cram, pass, forget, right, model, right? And doesn't just happen with science, it happens with everything. So unless they begin to really own it and live it, they're not going to walk out of their logic classes and be able to do this independently and on their own, which sadly is what a lot of our students need to do. You're here probably because you are going to be teaching logic, which is wonderful, and I'm thrilled about that. But the vast majority of our students get a logic class And even that year, while they're taking logic, the vast majority of their other teachers in their other classes have not taken logic. And the majority of the teachers that they're going to encounter in all of their years after that have not taken logic. And so the requirement, the onus is on the students to carry all of that forward, and largely independently, and which is an unfortunate situation, one I hope that we can remedy and change. It would be so wonderful if all of our history and literature teachers and our science and theology and mathematics teachers all just had a course in maybe introductory logic, something like the informal fallacies and basics of deductive reasoning, so that they could help these students not have to carry this on their own all the way through the rest of their lives, in order to be able to use it when they get to rhetoric. It's really not fair to the kids, and it's such a huge weight for them. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and I was exposed to Arabic as a very young girl. I had Arabic every single day for about 5 or 6 years. And I was really starting to get it while we were living there. I got there in, like kindergarten level, and then I left, around 5th or 6th grade, and I was really starting to get the hang of it. I could read a little bit of it. I could speak it. I could engage in a little bit of conversation with it. It's a pretty complex language. Got back to the United States, and nobody else speaks Arabic. I have very rarely, if ever, bumped into anyone who speaks Arabic. And at this point, the best I can do is greet someone warmly and ask for the bathroom. That's it. And I know my numbers. I know my numbers too. I can write my numbers, and I can still say my numbers up to 10. But it's largely because I didn't have anybody to help carry that with me and to continue to encourage me about how to use it and where to use it and give me opportunity to use it. And it's the same thing that happens with our logic classes as well. So in thinking in terms of the art of argument, as our first foray into the art of logic, right, the art of reasoning, the informal fallacies, the inductive side, we want to make sure that the teachers that they're going to connect with and engage with ongoing have this as a baseline that they can be calling out of and asking our students to engage with and apply and employ all the years forward. So that would be 7th or 8th grade for the art of argument, where we would begin that inductive, informal side of logic. The deductive side of logic is what we would, for the cap text, is the discovery of deduction. And I usually recommend that regardless of age, well, maybe not regardless of age, but to be considering with age as well, is that students should have successfully completed a course in pre-algebra before they try to take a discovery of deduction class or any symbolic logic or syllogistic logic, a deductive class of any kind. And the reason for that is because the art of argument in large part is going to be something that's very accessible. It happens with language. It's something that they're very familiar with. They bump into all the time. We're just giving them a language for how to identify it, engage, and work with it. But when we get to deductive logic, this is a brand new framework, and it has to do more with being able to reason in the abstract. And if students haven't successfully completed a course in pre-algebra, and I want to be clear, there's no math, for example, in the discovery of deduction. So it's not a math transferable skill that I'm looking for. It's their ability to reason in the abstract. And if they can hold out the idea of what a variable would be, and they can solve for an unknown, right? And they can begin to reason that way, then we know they're sort of developmentally ready to then take a course like discovery of deduction. And so that's the only reason why I give that as sort of a marker. Again, I would never give a student a placement evaluation that included any pre-algebra work in order to be able to take the class, but developmentally, they need to be able to reason in the abstract. And what I mean by that is they have to be able to separate and hold in suspension two different ideas, truth and validity. And they have to be able to understand that when they get to reasoning in the abstract, we are no longer driven by whether or not a statement is true or false, right? That is not what we're going for. What we are looking for is whether or not a statement, an argument is constructed in a valid way. It has to do with the form or the structure of the argument. And that's really the key here. Our hope, right, everybody's hope is that our students have landed on true premises and that they have created a valid construction of an argument, and that when they put these two things together, now they have a sound argument, right? Validity plus truth equals sound. But we have to be able to look at these two concepts as distinct from one another. Again, nobody ever does this in the real world. The two are intermingled inseparably, and that's good and right? When we, but for all of our purposes of our real world arguments. But if we want students to learn how to reason well, we need to be able to get them to focus on the form or the construction of their argument. And that's why we call this formal logic. I think formal logic often gets a little bit of a bad rap. It seems like it's the tuxedo version, right? It's the executive meeting logic, right? It's where you have to, it's all buttoned up and it's very, it's very rigid and in some ways, and you have to be a more serious person. And if you're not mathematical, you can't even do an introduction to it. And that's simply not the case. Informal logic, they're like the jeans and t-shirt version of logic for a lot of people, right? The pool party version. And it's an unfortunate connotation. Formal logic has nothing to do really with that kind of rigidity, although there are some unforgiving rules that you do have to follow. Same thing is true for just about anything though, right? But the reason why it's called formal logic is because the root there, the most important part that we're looking at is the form or the construction of an argument, not its content, right? And this is why when we say logic is both the art and the science of reason, I like to talk about it as being two sides of the same coin. We split these two sides apart only so that we can focus on them in a classroom for a year each and really give them their due study. But ultimately, if you've only taken informal logic, you have not taken a full introductory course of logic. You must take the scientific side, the deductive side, because logic is both of these two things. And so families who only do something like fallacy detective, or they only do the art of argument, they're really just kind of getting a couple of those tips and tricks kinds of things. We need to see how, when we put it back together again, right? When we pair the informal side of logic with the formal side of logic, now we can actually start to see how the two inform each other. You can see very easily once you've taken a class in deductive formal logic, why the fallacy of equivocation occurs in informal logic. We can see very clearly why sweeping generalizations is an informal fallacy once we learn what the square of opposition is and how universal truths flow to particular truths, but they don't flow the opposite way, okay? The truth of a particular statement doesn't transfer to the universal. It's an example of one kind of truth, but it is not representative of the universal. So we can see where hasty generalizations and sweeping generalizations, why those both can be fallacies on the informal side, but only after we've really studied the formal side of logic. And that's why we have to take both of these and pair them back together again, and then start to look at arguments as a whole. And at a certain point, we have to stop holding these two things as if they're two separate things for two different kinds of student. It's really all one thing. It's the art of reasoning, right? And both of these classes are both best done as a dialectic study of language and discussing together, which brings us to these ideas: everyday debate and argument builder, which would be the next two steps in the process. So we've finished our informal and formal studies of logic at this point, and now we're ready to really start engaging with debate and argumentation. And so everyday debate would be a one-semester course. And the argument builder would be another one-semester course, and usually we do those in the 9th grade year together, and back to back, one in the fall semester and one in the spring semester. Everyday Debate is going to sort of teach students how to go through and pair all of that now logical thinking with new topics and ideas and questions. And it's really what I think really lovely about it is it's taking students through the discovery process, the process of invention. And that's a term that we get to when we get to rhetoric. One of the 5 canons of rhetoric is, the very first one is the canon of invention, or discovery of arguments. What we very often find with students, and let's be honest, with some adults too, is we almost come with our foregone conclusion. We already know what we believe, and now we're just looking for the facts to try to prove what we believe. And very often we call that proof texting in many cases, right? Where we know we have an idea, we have a conclusion, we firmly believe that it's true, and now we're just picking and choosing the points or facts that we think help us to best promote our version of this argument. When in fact, the best way to go through this is to go into it with a system of inquiry, with questions, right? And to be a seeker of truth, not looking to necessarily prove that I'm already right about something. If you already know that you're right about something, then what's the point of going through the exercise? The point should be that we want to acquire new truth and knowledge, right? That we can that can become part of how we truly are moving towards our pursuit of the divine intellect, so that we can better know God, right? And that means there should always be some new piece of the puzzle that we are inching closer to in our pursuit of knowledge. Right? But just to kind of rehash all of the same arguments, if you've already done all of the the discovery work, and you already know what all of the right answers are, then maybe we pick a different topic, right? So that if the purpose is to learn how to do inquiry better and to seek truth and to know it, so that we can come to have a better appreciation for who we are in relationship to who God is, and then into the world that He created and formed. And anyway, the idea with Everyday Debate is it's going to give us some of those opportunities to do some of that work with our students. And then Argument Builder is a course that I like to refer to as almost rhetoric light, if you will. It basically takes you through the 5 canons of rhetoric, and then or some of the canons of rhetoric there, and teaches students how to see other arguments that are made, usually from the sort of famous classical, Western tradition sorts of, of friends. And I call all of the folks that I read, whether it's Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, they're all my friends because I've gotten to know them a little bit, some to some better degrees than others. But we use some of our classical education friends, part of the Western tradition, to see what they've said about things, and then to learn to pattern and understand what it is that they were doing in their process and what the argument looks like. It's a wonderful book. Both of those 2 books are written by Dr. Shelley Johnson. I want to say that she now teaches at, it'll come to me in a second. I'm going to leave that there for a moment because I don't remember off the top of my head. Georgetown. See, just took a minute. After 40, things take longer. Anyway, Georgetown. And then, so that would be probably the 9th grade year where we would do this Everyday Debate and Argument Builder piece. And then we're right on the doorstep, right on the threshold of taking on a course in rhetoric. And this is for a high school level course. Now, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you that I don't fully understand why CAP has published book 1 of our rhetoric series and book 3 of our rhetoric series without publishing book 2 in sequential order. We're just going to leave that aside for the people that make those decisions. It wasn't me. But Dr. Allison Barnes has written two books. One of them is Rhetoric Alive, and the other one is our Rhetoric Alive student thesis, our senior thesis book, rather. I've served as the content editor for both of those 2 books, and I can tell you that in looking through them, and obviously I've used other rhetoric texts as well. The best source of a great foundation would be to read the Rhetoric of Aristotle. So that would be, it would be important, I think, for anyone to read if you're going to be teaching rhetoric. I often tell teachers, you know, you should, yes, get a great curriculum that you and your students can go through together, but if you are able, and you know, as you have time, you might want to also supplement so that your scope of knowledge is not limited to the same textbook that your student's scope of knowledge is limited to. So for example, for teachers who are teaching the Discovery of Deduction class, I very often recommend, yes, read through that, make sure you can teach that book, that's very important, but you might want to pick up a copy of Peter Kreeft's Socratic Logic as well and read through that so that you have a little bit broader context of where inquiry lies and where deductive reasoning lies in sort of the larger conversation. It'll better equip you to answer some of those questions when your students get to that in Discovery of Deduction, which is intended to be a thinner, much more accessible version of a lot of those same concepts that Kreeft goes through. Similarly, I would recommend that you read some of Aristotle's Rhetoric before you pick up a copy of, or maybe, you know, maybe after you've done your first year or something. I know we don't always have the luxury of being as prepared to teach a class as we would like. I am one of those people too who's kind of like fake it till you make it, like at the beginning of the career, and then you kind of keep building into your you know, into the discipline that you're really going to anchor in. And so this has been over years I've continued to try to stock my mind as well. So but Aristotle's Rhetoric would be a good one to read as well. With Rhetoric Alive, it is going to go into that deep dive of the 5 canons of rhetoric, invention, style, arrangement, memory, and delivery. Sorry, arrangement, style. I'm sorry, invention, style, arrangement, memory, and delivery. And he'll walk us through, Dr. Barnes walks us through all of these. We talk about the ethos, the pathos, and the logos of an argument as well. Also very important context for what students are learning to do. There's a different kind of appeal depending on what kind of writing that a student is doing. And we need to know what the ethos, the pathos, and the logos of the speaker actually is as well. One of the cautions I would give to anybody who's starting to teach a class in rhetoric, maybe 2 things. One is to remember that when Aristotle talks about he is supposing that his students have had logic before they take rhetoric, and he does suppose that his students have had logic before they take rhetoric, he is not supposing that they have taken a course in the informal fallacies. That wasn't a thing in the same way that we think of the informal fallacies as being a distinct thing then as it is now. He's really talking about symbolic or syllogistic logic. He's really talking about categorical logic, something like you would find in the Discovery of Deduction. And the reason for that is that a syllogism teaches students to take 2 true premises, craft a valid argument, and from there, with certainty, be able to infer a true conclusion. And this is essential for students who are trying to build an outline or to build in a valid argument into their larger and into their paper. This would be where we find that thesis statement. They really ought to be able to prove their thesis statement logically before they start writing a paper. That is essential. And so what I talk to my students about, and this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but a syllogism is really kind of like the deepest core part of any good outline. And from there, we need to build out from that. So the core, the premise and conclusion, the minor premise and the major premise, or the major premise and minor premise, leading to that ultimate conclusion, that should be the thesis argument. Now, both the major premise and the minor premise might also need a little bit of proving. So maybe if you think of it almost like a tree, right, there might need to be a syllogism that proves the major premise is true and a valid argument to get there. and a syllogism that proves the minor premise is true, and a valid syllogism to get there, so that the ultimate major premise and minor premise and conclusion can be based on true and accurate facts and information, as well as on a sound, resting on a sound foundational valid argument. And now we've got a sound argument at our core. And from there, then, students can really start to build out what are their points that they want to use to start to craft that larger argument for their paper. And of course, we need to fold into their, wisdom and eloquence and, some other things. But at the heart of it, it should be a syllogism that students can hold up as being their valid argument for that paper. Now, I want to be clear too, you cannot write a syllogism with wisdom and eloquence. There is nothing beautiful about a syllogism. I have to remind my students all the time that deductive syllogistic arguments are not supposed to be lovely. They are formulaic by nature, and it's to just make sure that at the core of our thinking, we've got it all, we've got it solid as far as how we want to present this argument. When they actually go to do the writing, they're probably going to adorn it with lots of other rhetorical devices and eloquent language, and obviously they're going to be, the order in which they present the issues, there's going to have a part of the arrangement, and there's going to be a style element, all of it that goes into writing something lovely. But we want to make sure that that's at the core of any paper as well. So skipping deductive logic in order to get to rhetoric is probably not the way to go. And Dr. Barnes and I went back and forth a couple of times, and I kept insisting we have got to have a good chapter on logic in this book, because if students end up in this class that haven't taken logic before, that deductive logic, we've got to give them sort of like the crash course in it. And she and I agreed on that, and she wrote a great chapter on the logic conclusion in there as well, which is really well done. So I said that there were two things to sort of mention about preparing for logic and sort of cautions. That is one, that we not skip over deductive logic, because that is the logic that Aristotle is sort of assuming your students are coming with when they hit rhetoric. The second caution that I would note here is that very often I see students, sometimes teachers and parents also, judging whether or not their student when they've written that senior thesis or their paper, they judge whether or not the kid hit a home run with how well they let the other side have it. And I have seen so many papers that have been written over the years where there's a little bit of arrogance, that you can definitely tell that they are getting some cheers from people who already agree with them. And this is really, it's airtight, it's well crafted, and boy, it's a whopper, right? But I would just want to walk us back to what Aristotle's definition of rhetoric is, and it's the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Persuasion is the key idea in what a rhetorical piece ought to be. And persuasion assumes that there are two people who disagree about something. And so if your students are writing their papers in order just to let the other side really have it, I wonder if they have missed their opportunity to be persuasive, because the goal of a persuasive essay should be that someone who disagreed with them before now has reason, opportunity, and the inclination to agree with them now. And if we've just let them have it, and we have put them in their place, and we've been condescending, we've framed all of their arguments as straw man arguments, we've been kind of rude and dismissive to their side of things, then it very often is the case that there is no persuasion there. But I mean, it's a 1-2 punch for sure. But how many people have been persuaded? And that's really the ultimate goal of rhetoric, is to be persuasive. And I do hear a lot of people questioning, how do you hold integrity if you're talking about issues that with someone that you really disagree with, or the issue is one that you just cannot abide and be a person of integrity? How do you do that? And those are some really great questions to think about. I never ever ask my students to compromise on what they know to be true and right and good. I never ask students to feel like they're being disingenuous in any way, but there has to be a way that they can be respectful and gentle with those to whom they are speaking, so that the other side has opportunity to be persuaded. 1 Peter 3:15 is where we are cautioned to always be ready to give a defense for the reason, right, of the hope that is within us, but there's a comma, but do so with gentleness and respect. And so often I feel like that last phrase in that verse, sometimes just, it's not quite as important. He told us to have a good reason, right? And be ready to give it anytime anybody asks, but he said to do it with gentleness and respect as well. And so those would just be two quick cautions I would want to give to you as you are embarking on what the senior thesis in particular, where students usually pick something that they are very passionate about, and we love that. But as we walk through the text, it takes you, we actually turned this one, as you can see, into a spiral bound, because it is intended to be a workbook of sorts where they are really engaging in the book here. And I mean, there's blank pages provided so that they can keep all of it together. Now, many of our students do type their work, or you don't have to do it in here, but it does kind of keep the exercise right there with the content that's being provided to them, and then they can kind of engage with things. And it is a step-by-step all the way through, sort of the soup to nuts of doing a senior thesis to include not just the paper submission, which is very important, but also the speech. And those are two different kinds of writing as well. We have all, and we know exactly what this is like, where someone has written an academic paper and their speech version of the paper is to read it from start to finish, right? It's a different art to stand up and talk to people, right? And to engage with people persuasively as a speech, as an orator. And so this book really tries to make sure that you understand that there's a distinction in how these two final pieces have to be presented. One to an audience that is able to sit and read and reread, and there's footnotes and annotations and all of those kinds of things. They can set it down, they can come back. But then, a persuasive orator that needs to be able to deliver the same kind of persuasive argument on the same topic, and possibly with many of the same examples and reasons, but it has to be done a little bit differently so that it can be engaging with an audience as well. So I've used up my first 40 minutes here, so I'm going to stop talking. And I've seen some questions come in on the chat box. I know Emily is tackling all of those. Thank you so much, Emily. And so I just wanted to stop here and see. I don't know how, Emily, if you usually do this. Do you usually toss me the questions, or do I start picking people, or how do you do this?
I can definitely start tossing you some questions, and if you all have more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. We may not have time to get to everyone's, but we will do our best. Okay, so let me pull up what I've got so far. And I know we've had a lot of repeated questions. Many of you are just trying to figure out where you would place your students depending on their specific background that they've had, or the short time frame that you're looking at, or things like that. Jolie, I think it might actually be helpful if you could just quickly go back over the order of the books. And we've had several people ask about high schoolers starting with no background in logic, or having a middle schooler that maybe just has 1 year and then they're going to go off to a school that doesn't teach logic or rhetoric. So maybe just kind of connecting those dots a little bit if you're working on a short time frame, or you're trying to catch up a student who has not had any logic background.
Those are such good questions. And so I should say that there's the ideal, which, let's be honest, probably few of us have had our ideal education, right? None of us, at least I did not get mine too. And we've all done fine, right? We got here, we're at a point, we're making progress, and we're pursuing. So I want to dispel that notion that there's some like Midas gold version of what this is, and that is the only way to get through logic and rhetoric, okay? So I've laid out for you what the ideal best is, and I'll say what that is again, and then I'll give you a couple of options for students. So if I were going to start with students in 7th grade, Okay, I would have them do the art of art. And again, these are students who would be developmentally ready. So if you've got that 6th grader who is probably an old, like sort of like an older like an older 5th grader because some of you are in like co-ops and we sometimes finagle things a little bit, to get kids into different classrooms. So if this is like would be like an older 5th grader who's in 6th grade, this kid might not be ready for 7th grade logic, right? So leaning things up a little bit, you need to make sure that everybody's developmentally ready. There's no harm in waiting just a little bit, right? So developmentally ready, art of argument for a year. And I should just, let me pause here real quickly. This is probably the most fun of all of them, okay? I mean, you can have a blast with the art of argument. If something I do every year with my students is a Super Bowl Sunday. I watch the Super Bowl unless the Steelers are playing, who I cheer for. No hate mail, please. But if the Steelers are playing, I watch for the game. If not, I just watch for the commercials. Back when I first started in 1999, I had to sit with my VCR and like record all of the commercials so that I could like show them to my class later. But people do that for you now with like the Wall Street Journal does it sometimes. Other ones, they'll curate the Super Bowl commercials for you. You can be watching the night of and just sort of taking notes about what fallacies you see in all of the commercials. It's kind of fun to do. And then you'll know which ones are the skanky ones that you would never show to children or to adults of any kind, right? And then you could pick out the ones that you would want to share with your class. And so the week after Super Bowl Sunday, if whatever 2 days I have to teach logic, those are Super Bowl commercial fallacy detection Sundays, and it's always a hit. Okay, there's so much fun that you can have with this. Remember that kids at this age need to learn sort of in caricature. They are not going to be able to delve into Thomas Aquinas and start with the Summa Theologica in order to find, fallacies and like be looking for argumentation. We're asking for too much there. Start with what they can access, and that will include some of these kinds of pop culture things that include some commercials, not exclusively, but that would be fun, some of it, and it's a lot of fun. So the art of argument for like a year in 7th grade. Then we would do the discovery of deduction for a year in the 8th grade. Usually I can take that discovery of deduction and finish it in about 2/3 of a year. And then I spend the last third of the year and I read Mere Christianity with the students, because C.S. Lewis loved to write with great terms, propositions, and arguments. And it makes it he's a very accessible reader so that they can start to see how do you put together a really well-crafted argument in narrative form. And so we always read Mere Christianity together. I've had emails from parents all over the years when I've done it, when I've done it at different times, and I'll get, my child like came to Jesus because they got to read this in class. We've always gone to church, but this was an extra, it was the extra oomph the kid needed, kind of thing. So it's wonderful to go through. I've used other books as well, but Mere Christianity is a great one to put as the end of that discovery of deduction class, to teach them some Socratic seminar skills and to like really kind of look for argument and action in narrative form. Then I would do in the 9th grade, everyday debate for fall semester and argument builder for spring semester. And then I would do a year of, in 10th grade, I would do a year of Rhetoric Alive. And I'm going to skip over 11th grade just for a quick second, because senior thesis, and I told you we don't presently have a book for the Rhetoric 2 level right now. So I'm going to give you like what you could do in that year. But then you can do senior thesis, obviously, for their senior year in high school. I have seen some families choose to do senior thesis in junior year, knowing that their senior year is often a year where they do, and just keep this in mind too, a whole extra lift of college entrance essays. And, in addition to all of their other schoolwork and everything. And so they are, you have to almost accept that if they're applying to colleges, that college entrance essays is part of what they're going to be doing for part of their end of their junior, beginning of their senior year, and just acknowledge that is going to be part of their work pie. And so some folks choose to do their senior thesis junior year so that they have a little bit more time to spread those things out. That second year of rhetoric, while we're waiting for this next book to come out, which I think is going to be really wonderful, I'll tell you what I have done as a Rhetoric 2 class, and it did involve a lot of stitching together, but I was building this curriculum on my own, but it was probably one of the most fun and best classes I've ever done. I reached out to, we have a college down the road, Messiah College, now Messiah University, and I reached out to them. That's where I went to college, and I invited college professors from 7 different departments: philosophy, literature, like English department, engineering, political science, mathematics, business. I think I had 2 business. Anyway, I asked them to, and peppered them in, the apologetics team as well, so 7. I asked, and they peppered them in and scheduled these speakers. I made arrangements over the summer, and I asked them to come in and talk to my students about what excellence in writing looks like in their discipline. And this was done during their junior year. And they did 2 things. It was sort of like a great experiment. Before I say what they did, let me just point out that a lot of college professors are required to do some sort of community service as part of their, because of where they are and like with their role with the university or college, and they will come for free. You don't have to pay them in many cases. So that's just something to think about. So I, without telling them that we teach classical rhetoric, and that, we need to consider the needs of the audience, and we need to consider the ethos of the speaker, and all of those kinds of things. My students who had taken Rhetoric 1 had all of that language and all of that framework already. Now they were in Rhetoric 2. I invited these professors to come in and tell us what excellence in writing looks like. And even though they didn't have the vocabulary to say exactly with the same words, they were essentially saying that the rhetorical skills that they learned in Rhetoric 1 were transferable in every single discipline. That the same kinds of things that you need to consider about how to write well in our formal rhetoric classes for a classical rhetoric class are transferable to these very practical disciplines that they are going to be engaged with in college. And this was one of those, like, you are kidding me. I mean, the kids were just came alive with realizing this hasn't been a waste of time. This is really, I need this, right? And watching that light bulb go off was a lot of fun. And the teachers, all the professors was kind of like, did I tell you what you needed to hear? And I'm like, yes, you did. You did very well. The second thing was I kind of turned it into a little bit of a longer extended class on those days. And then for the second part of the class, I just let the kids ask the professors questions about what the discipline was like. What's it like to be a student in the philosophy department? What can we do with it? Right? Big question for the philosophy department. And they loved having that access to someone in each one of those disciplines to talk about what a profession could be like, or what it looks like to be a student in that profession, that kind of thing. And it turned out to be a really great piece to give them right in that middle of that junior year, or throughout that junior year, as they were just getting ready to think about college. So that's something else you could do right there, and give them lots of writing assignments for some of those different disciplines. I think we sometimes forget that what mathematicians do, if they are actual mathematicians, they do not sit around with calculators all day long. They write papers. They write proofs. They write, but they write for explanations. There's even writing that gets done in math, in the math professions that we, not necessarily in the math teacher, but for mathematicians as a scholar, as an academic. So that's something to just kind of to consider as well. So that's sort of the best case scenario, like if you've got all the years. If you don't have all the years, I would suggest not skipping over logic, but definitely taking that Rhetoric 1 class. So if you've only got 2 years to work with, that is like the most trimmed down version of it. Try to get the logic class into 1 year, even though they're not going to be able to kind of live into it as much as you might really like, but they've got the exposure for both the informal and the formal logic and how to build arguments. And then give them that Rhetoric 1 class where they're really going through the 5 canons of rhetoric with the discovery, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery process. And those would be like the most trimmed down, right? You've just got 2 years. You can do that just in high school if you need to. And then from there, you really have a lot of room to play with. If you've got logic as your anchor on the back end and you're not going to sacrifice that, because that is what informs what kind of a writer and thinker they're going to be, then you can, if you've got 3 years, maybe it's the logic. You still maybe cram the logic into 2 years, but you do the Rhetoric 1 and the senior thesis. If you've got 4 years, maybe you split the logic into the 2 years that they need, and then you do the 2 years of rhetoric, right? And then if you've got 5 years, you kind of build in from there. But that's kind of how I would think about it. Don't compromise on the logic side, on the both formal and informal, and then don't compromise on that first year of Rhetoric 1 where they're really learning how to write a paper well for the first time. And then after that, kind of build out from there. Does that make sense to everybody? That's just my recommendation. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. So please don't hear that as like, the Bible version of how to get it done. You know, I'm sure you'll make a good, wise choice.
Can I jump in and throw in there? We've had a lot of people asking about homeschooling and doing this in groups or doing it individually. So I think a lot of people are wondering, you know, what can you accomplish if your student is working alone, and what do you really need more of a group setting for, if anything?
So this is where we get to, now we are in, I mean, when you're in the dialectic, right, which is another word for our logic, it supposes that you are going to have discussion, and a lot of it. So I would say, I'm trying to think how to say this positively. I would always do logic, even if the child is by him or herself. So, I mean, you're going to get something good out of it, but that wouldn't be the class that I would say is best done independently. You want them to be bumping into kids and parents, and even so you can play devil's advocate sometime as a pedagogical tool, where they have to, you know, really get into something and respond to the issues that are coming up. And that's best done in a group. So especially for middle school kids who, and my daughter is 12, I am like right on the threshold of losing my sanity. Okay. She wants to argue about everything, and God love her. As a logic teacher, I think it's wonderful, but as a parent, I'm exhausted. Anyway, so she's at that stage, and I want her to be able to be around, you know, with directed study with other kids so that we can be talking about this together. She needs to hear the good arguments and the bad ones that other students are making, and be able to learn how to respond to those arguments with gentleness and respect as well. Rhetoric, as far as writing goes, could be done a little bit more independently. But again, when the thing that I find for a lot of homeschool families in particular, there's such a richness that comes with homeschooling, and there's richness that comes with school setting as well. But one of the things that I find that happens a lot with homeschool kids is that when parents are the only ones giving feedback to their students, parents learn to speak that student's language. So I have learned, you know how like when you have a 3-year-old and they're just learning how to speak, and you're the only one that really can understand them, and then you translate for them all the time, right? When you have a 2 or 3-year-old and they're just learning how to do that, parents keep doing that. And when your kid makes a bad argument, but you know what they meant, it's fine, right? And you don't call them out on it, you are just enabling them to continue to habituate those bad habits. They really need another kid or another teacher to read what they're writing and say, I do not understand what you mean here, because they haven't learned to speak that student's language. And it forces the student to have to learn how to articulate themselves in ways that actually make sense. So if you are going to do rhetoric even more independently, I would encourage an objective third party who is really going to hold the kid, not somebody who's just going to be like their favorite aunt who just tells them they did awesome, okay? But somebody who's really going to hold them to it and make sure that they are clearly and concisely communicating their thoughts, and that they're going to have to understand the curriculum and everything. It's going to be an investment for that person to do that. But that's the only way to get them out of their own head and to avoid the temptation to think that everybody's just automatically tracking along with what their thoughts are. Because we, as you know, as parents and teachers, we are not mind readers, and sometimes it's really hard to figure out what they're saying. So that's a good exercise to go into. So peer review is very, very good. Other teachers reading students' work is such a huge help at that age. So it's never ideal at this point to continue to sort of work in a silo, but you still should do it even if that is where your limitation is. Did that answer that question? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. That's good. Thank you. Let's see. All right. We are getting a few questions about how other CAP curriculum lines fit in with the logic and rhetoric, like specifically writing and rhetoric. We've had a few people asking about that. I know I'm sharing in the chat box right now. I'm going to drop in a few links. So let me just briefly say a couple things about that. You can look at our FAQ page, the CAP FAQ page, which I just shared in the box. You do have to, there's just one FAQ link. So you have to go through and just scroll down to the product line that you're looking for. But there are a lot of helpful answers to questions on there. And then I'm also going to share some of the product line links to our website. But again, you can go through and look, everything's kind of broken up individually. Art of Argument, Discovery, Deduction, Rhetoric Alive, they all have different links. And again, there's a lot of helpful information on the website to describe the products. You can click on specs under each product to see whether it's a semester course or a year-long course. There's a lot of really helpful information. And if we don't get to any of your questions here, you can always email us at info@classicalsubjects.com, and I will drop that in the box too. Oh, I was thinking, we've been asked, yes, about our curriculum line. So if you could answer that, that would be great. And then several people have asked about the resources that you mentioned. So maybe if you could just go back over those with titles and authors, Peter Kreeft, et cetera.
Right. Very good. So I did just see one question pop up about whether or not you could use the curriculum in public schools. We have created all of these texts that I'm talking about so that they are non-sectarian, so that you would be able to use them in a public school setting. You should be able to do that. Of course, you just want to verify, but that has been part of the intentionality of creating them that way. I mean, it's not a secret, obviously, that most of us here are Christians and that is what is informing what we do, but that we have created them such that they could be used in that way. So just as an FYI there. So how does it synthesize? How does all this synthesize with maybe the writing and rhetoric? So writing and rhetoric, it says on the back of the book that you can start writing in rhetoric, the Fable book 1, in 3rd grade. I have found for some of the work that I have done, just me personally, that sometimes just waiting till 4th grade is just a little bit better, only because there's a lot of writing that goes on in there, and kids that are in 3rd grade are sometimes still learning to read well and not just reading to learn, right? That idea, and so that can sometimes just be a little bit more of a barrier. So again, developmentally, you think about where your kids kind of are. Usually, those books are done in pairs. So books 1 and 2 would be done the first year. Books 3 and 4 would be done the second year. Right? 5 and 6, then 7 and 8, 9 and 10. We have up through book 10 published. So that's 5 years of writing and rhetoric. And if you were to start in the 4th grade, that would be 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, right? And so then the question is, well, now that means in the 7th grade, while you're finishing off the 7th grade books, you would be doing the Art of Argument. And in the 8th grade, while you're finishing up books 9 and 10, you would be doing Discovery of Deduction. And now when you get to the 9th grade, this is when I would say things start to there is a little bit more of a confluence here between writing and logic. And that's where we would say Everyday Debate and Argument Builder would be the books for 9th grade, right? And that's where the confluence sort of comes in together. Now, we do have 2 more books that are going to be coming out, the book 11 and book 12, and they are intended to be sort of that upper middle school, lower high school that you could use instead of Everyday Debate and Argument Builder if you wanted to. A lot of people, I think, will probably still use Everyday Debate just because that's kind of, whether it's as an elective or as a second, something extra. And then they might do books 11 and 12 when those 2 books come out. But the pair of Everyday Debate and Argument Builder is still, I think you kind of have some options there in 9th grade about what to do once those last 2 books come out. And again, they're not finished yet. But those last 2 books are going to be going through a thesis writing process. I think it's thesis 1 and thesis 2, a thesis writing process, again, for the upper middle school, lower high school version, right? And then the idea is that when they get to the senior thesis, that they are doing this on a much more academic level, right? When they get up into 11th and 12th grade level areas. Well-ordered language would get stacked right along with writing and rhetoric. So usually when you're doing writing and rhetorics, books 1 and 2, you'd be doing well-ordered language, books 1A and 1B. And then when you'd be doing writing and rhetoric, books 3 and 4, you'd be doing well-ordered language, which is the grammar series, books 2A and 2B, and so forth, as you kind of go through. And again, at a certain point, the grammar study will cease to be its own individual discipline, and it will be assumed that you're employing and executing, right, with good grammar as you were doing your writing and your debates and all those kinds of things. Oh, and then the resources. So this book is The Rhetoric and Poetics of Aristotle, and it is edited by Edward P.J. Corbett, so by Edward Corbett. And this is just the English translation of the books. So I have given this to students in the past, but we have read it together, had the excerpt, we've gone through it, the exposition together, and then we've gone from there. I have never given this to, say, like a 10th grader and just told them to go read it and think that they're going to be able to unpack it all by themselves or make all of the right connections. So this would be either for your study or maybe as a supplement to something else that you're doing. The other one that I had referenced was, and I honestly don't know if it's Peter Kreeft or Peter Kraft. I have asked his TA, and I have not gotten a final answer on this. So anyway, but Socratic Logic, and his last name is spelled Kreeft. And that is the book that I usually, and even if you pick up a copy of the Discovery of Deduction, the teacher's edition, in here there is is this the teacher's edition? Oh wait, no, it's in the supplemental packet. I've given in the supplemental packet sort of like a 32-week how you could teach the class, where and there's a section there about which chapters in Socratic Logic would be great to help inform you as you prepare to teach certain chapters in Discovery of Deduction. So I've tried to kind of match it up for you. Kreeft's book doesn't go through the content in the same order that we present the content. So I've tried to do the matching for you so that you know sort of which chapters there might inform your teaching of Discovery of Deduction if you're doing that. So that's a helpful thing in the PDF resource that has extra worksheets and the tests and quizzes and all that kind of thing for as an extension of the teacher's edition.
Thank you. We have a couple of people asking about Scholarly Academy classes and how those line up with what you've been talking about. Specifically, we've had somebody asking if you could take Discovery of Deduction and the Persuasive Writing and Debate concurrently via Scholarly. So could you just briefly mention what we have available and what you might be able to take at the same time?
So we offer all of these classes that I've just gone through. Now, I should also say that our classes are, I don't know if it's because of COVID and people are unsure about whether or not their schools are opening, but our classes are in many cases selling very, very quickly. So if you are interested in, perusing some of those, you'll want to go to, and Emily's probably giving the website address there right now, and you can kind of go in and see what classes are available, that kind of thing. But we do offer all of these classes. We do give suggested prerequisites for classes. So I don't think that, so there is nothing about the art of argument that you have to, it's not like a math class where, like, if you've missed first grade math, you just cannot do second grade math. It isn't connected. It's not cumulative in that way, but you're missing a whole side of the context for what it is that we're going to be doing if you haven't taken the books, the two logic books, together in some way, back to back or what have you. So we do say that there is a prerequisite to take the art of argument first, but that I wouldn't let that necessarily stop a student who feels like they've already taken something similar to it or that kind of thing. So you could go ahead and take that class. The Everyday Debate and the Argument Builder, the students who are going to probably be strongest in those two classes are the kids who have had both sides of logic and who have also had some exposure and a well-stocked mind, right? Some exposure to lots of good writing, varying opinions, healthy conversation, robust, good arguments, right? Not bickering, but good arguments and debate. Those are the students who are probably going to be most successful in those two classes. But we would let the instructor kind of interview the family and everything if they haven't taken logic and see if they think it would still be good fit. Ultimately, what we try to do is set the students up for success. Nobody wants a kid to go into a class that they're unprepared for, and we should have known better than put them in there, and then let them sink. And now they start to sort of identify as a student who is less than, not smart enough, doesn't get it. I mean, we've all seen that happen, and that's all we're trying to guard against so that the students can have the best opportunity for success in any grade. So we try to do that with a lot of, we're not militant about it, but we do want to, have some guidelines to help make sure that the student can do as well as possible. So we would talk to the parent, or the teacher would talk to the parent about that for any kind of placement that wasn't the ideal fit into the class, and just make sure that they'd be ready.
There was a really great question that was asked a little bit ago about if you were in a school setting and you don't necessarily have the time to make this an entire separate class period, where could you fit logic in? And I think that goes really nicely with what you were just saying, that this is not a subject where you necessarily have to have all these pieces. And I think a lot of people have asked, can I start my child? Is it too late? I would say no to that. I agree with many of you in the chat box who have said some logic is better than no logic. So I would definitely agree with that. And it's a wonderful building block for anything your kid is going to be learning, even if they don't go on to study rhetoric. There's a lot of benefit in studying logic, but yes, could this be incorporated into a language arts, or how could you build in logic and rhetoric or debate into a course schedule?
So those are all really good questions. We want to just adjust expectations, right? If it's going to be into an English class of some kind, and you're just going to talk, and you're going to kind of use the informal fallacies more as the vocabulary list, then we're probably not packaging this in such a way that they're going to be able to carry it through, on by themselves in the same way. But if all of your English teachers across all of your grades are incorporating it a little bit, then they are going to be able to, over time, get some of that benefit. But if it's just as part of that one 7th grade English class, and that's all that they're getting, it is, then we're probably not doing it the service that it really needs to have. Would I still do it if that was my only option? Of course, I'd still do it. And I'd probably offer, lots of fun ways to kind of extend that through a club of some kind, or, that kind of thing. So your extracurriculars might be the best place to kind of present some of this information, knowing that it's more of an academic club. Students might not get credit for it, but I've seen students who have joined an academic club and been very, very happy and excited about it. Now, you do have to have a little bit more of an element, like maybe a little bit more element of fun in there than you do, and you have to be a little bit more forgiving because it's a club and not a class kind of thing. But I would still think that going through and doing the art of argument together, especially with all of the myriad ways that you can find fallacies. I mean, you can find fallacies in Horton Hears a Who. Okay. It's a movie. You can find in there the Princess Bride, fantastic. Podcasts, great examples in lots and lots of podcasts. It's everywhere. So doing it as a club, a fallacy detection kind of a club, and using something like the art of argument to kind of go through and work together would be a fantastic idea to do. The discovery of deduction doesn't really lend itself so much to like a club-like activity, because it is a little bit more of a formal study in that sense, where you do need students to be keeping up with the reading and that kind of thing. It is just, it requires a little bit more dedication. A debate class would be wonderful, or a debate club would be, really excellent. I have found out the hard way, though. I was working at a school in Arkansas a number of years ago, and I was brand new there, and they're like, "Oh, do you want to do that?" Just sort of mid-year, our teacher isn't here. Do you want to do the debate club for us? Sort of stepping in. The kids were ill-prepared and everything, and so all we did was I gave them a crash course in fallacies, and I had them learn how to identify the bad arguments that the other students were going to be making, and they ended up winning the debate competition, not because they had crafted really great arguments for themselves, but they had taken the points away from the other kids who were trying to make good arguments. And we were told that we weren't allowed to do that anymore after we won that one. So we do need to give some actual time to be able to teach them how to debate well and not just be able to critique. And that is what middle schoolers love to do. They love to critique other people's arguments. They are exacting, right? They are unforgiving in many ways. And so we need to teach them how to spot fallacies, but also learn how to construct. And a debate club might be a really great place to be able to do some of that.
Sorry, I'm muted. There we go. Thank you so much. We're about to hit our max cutoff time for this webinar. Is there anything else you want to add in closing comments before we end?
Oh, I'm just so excited that you all are doing this. This is wonderful, wonderful work. that you're doing. I hope you have lots of success this year. And feel free to write in and let us know how things are going. And if you have questions, we've got some folks who answer those questions. Sometimes it's me. So if you send in questions, we can make sure that we get you answers. But I'm so thankful to see so many of you who are engaging with these topics and this discipline. This is wonderful. This is such a bigger group than it was the first, even 10 years ago. The group just gets bigger. I'm so thrilled about that.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to remind you all quickly that we are going to post this video recording on our YouTube channel. Excuse me, we have a Classical Academic Press YouTube channel, and actually some of Joelle Hodge's other webinars are up there currently on teaching classes online and a lot of other helpful things. But we will put this up by the end of next week, so you can just keep an eye out for that. It will include both the talk and the Q&A session. Though someone asked this, we will not be able to share the chat box. So I hope you got what you needed from the chat box as we were rolling through. But again, look at our FAQ page on our website, classicalacademicpress.com, and you can look at all of the product lines that were mentioned in the talk today. We don't sell those additional resources on the website. Somebody asked that, Peter Kraft. Somebody shared how to pronounce his name. I haven't looked that up yet. But anyway, we just appreciate you so much, you joining us today. And please email us or get in touch if you have more questions. Okay, Jolie, are you good to sign off?
Yes, I am just telling Susan Kramer thank you and to give my best to her son. I haven't seen her in ages. That's great. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you all for being here.